Good evening everybody. Thank you so much for coming out on a Monday evening. I'm Paul Baines-Fair, the Director General of the IPA, and it's great to be here to launch the 22nd Advertising Works book. This all started back in 1980. This is the original book from 35 years ago, and over the course of that time we've now got well over 1,000 case studies that are the envy of the world. I do quite a lot of traveling around, and it's always a surprise to me how many people have heard about what goes on over here in this market and how we have all this data and understanding of how advertising works. And as I say, even in the more sophisticated markets, they can only look and in wonder at what we've achieved. So here we are to launch the 22nd annual book. Lorna Hawtin's been the convener of the judges. She's going to take over from me in a moment. She's going to talk about the layout of Advertising Works 22. Then we're going to have a premiere, all published by Walk, of course. We're really grateful for their continued sponsorship and support. And then we're going to have the premiere of our first brand stories on film, which is in partnership with our other great supporter, Thinkbox. And that's all going to be on Foster's, the 2014 Grand Prix winner. And after that, we're going to hear from Toby Harrison, who was the planning partner at Adam and Eve, and he's going to talk us through all of that. If you've got any questions, can you keep them to the end, where we'll have a Q&A session. But now over to you, Lorna, to kick us off.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. As Paul said, I was convener of judges this year, so I got the pleasure of reading over 70 cases, and it's nice to see actually some of the faces of the judges and all various people involved in the awards over the last year. So it's really nice to see everybody here today for the launch of the film. Some of you may have heard or read some of the things that I've said around the awards, around the idea of seeing these cases not just as cases, but as business stories, and how thinking about business challenges and strategies in terms of stories can be really kind of liberating and really open your eyes to answering your own problems. Tonight, I'm not really going to kind of talk any more about that, but I think what tonight's about is really focusing in on the idea of the awards as being a treasure house of learning. And we've reflected that this year in the structure of the book itself. In the past, the book has been organised as a series of chapters based on the awards, so gold, silvers and bronzes. And it became quite clear through the judging process that there were a series of really interesting themes or areas which were being enlightened by the cases. So rather than arranging it in a kind of order according to the awards, what we felt would be really interesting is to really emphasise some of the learning that came out of the discussions. And so we rejigged things a little, and what we've got here is several learning themes with a chapter or an introduction written by various people, which I'm glad to see some of the authors here today, that really just provides a point of view or a reflection on what some of the cases were saying about that particular area. You know, and certain things you may agree with, certain points you may disagree with, but we felt it was a more valid way to start to think about the awards, not just as a set of stories and a series of prizes that have been awarded, but really as a treasure house of learning that we can extract things from that are going to be of use in your daily working lives. And so these are the themes that kind of emerged, and they emerged in a couple of ways. Some of them are themes based around a number of cases that were just tackling the same kind of issue, and then there were certain themes which were much more about a point of view that emerged. Of course, I haven't done all the hard work here. In fact, the chapters that are written about each one of the themes are being written by this illustrious crew. I think you probably recognise a few of yourselves and a few of your faces. So what I thought would be useful tonight would be to just start to talk to you, introduce those themes to you in a little bit more detail, and just give you a bit of a flavour for what might be enjoyed within the book itself. So, one of the first themes that emerged was the idea of staging a comeback. And so this chapter is really about helping us understand why comebacks are a particularly important and powerful marketing strategy. And I think what we saw was there's so many cases came in this year which were about either market leaders or really strong brand leaders that were maybe falling on more difficult times, and how they unlock a complete turnaround in their business fortunes. And you'll see some of the brands there underneath, Foster's being one of them, ITV, Garnier. There was a whole series of cases that really told this comeback story. And I think we can all identify with that, you know, looking at our own business challenges of a moment in time when you think actually what we need right now is a comeback. So this chapter is really about, you know, why, for instance, communications alone is not going to save a brand. And there's 5 interesting lessons as to how to achieve a successful relaunch. And I'm not going to take you through the detail of these because I want you to obviously buy the book. But what I thought might be quite useful is just to give you a bit of a flavour of some of the things that have emerged. And one of the things that came through quite strongly in these cases was the importance actually of having a saviour, which is somebody within the organisation who takes it upon themselves to drive change. And actually a lot of these stories were founded on not just a communications plan, but a re-engineering of a product or a service or a distribution. And that investment that goes into the heart of a comeback was another really important learning. But one of the crucial factors was having a voice internally that was willing to take on the conventions within an organisation and turn it around. So if you see some of the brands there, like ITV, hugely popular over a vast number of years, you know, having to do quite a significant change in the way they think about their organisation, that internal voice, that fresh pair of eyes was really important. And a lot of those cases also talked about looking back to look forwards, a sort of back to the future approach. And a lot of the answers, strategic answers to the big questions they were asking, were already within the organisation. And again, ITV is another example of that, but also Foster's too. You know, they look back to the heritage, the communication heritage of Paul Hogan in the 80s, the use of humour, that kind of way of engaging with their audience, although it was clearly updated, was rooted somehow in the origins of the brand. So that, again, that looking back was really key, and making sure that the turnaround was founded in some truth of the organisation. Another thing that came out was being the zig to your own zag, so finding a weakness and actually doing exactly the opposite. And I think Mercedes is a really good example of a brand that had to do that. It had become seen as rather staid, a little bit stuffy, maybe a little bit older than the core market of people who were buying the prestige cars. And so what they had to do was actually tackle that head on. And you'll see in that case story a real kind of adoption of a behaviour. As it says at the end, people watch your feet, not your lips. And I think that's a really good example of that. You have to kind of behave your way out of that problem that you've got yourself into. And the final point, I suppose, about this area is about how important it is to that fortune favours the bold. And actually, you know, there's some quite radical shifts in not only communications, but the way products are delivered. And Only Jeans is a really good example, or interesting example, of a case where they, you know, they'd relied in marketing terms on the glossy lookbook for years and years and years, and they had to move vast amounts of their marketing budget out of that activity and into something completely new. And they created this online interactive sort of fashion catalogue that you could engage with, and it played out a story as a real drama. That's a huge, bold move of budget for a client. So I think there's some really interesting learnings there in terms of staging a comeback and the things that you can learn. The second area was around behavioural economics, and obviously that's an agenda that the IPA has been supporting for a number of years. And I think one of the things that struck us and came out in the judging process was behavioural economics has often been talked about in quite theoretical terms. There's lots of jargon, lots of words bandied around, and it's really nice to start to see cases such as the ones that are featured here come forward, which are not only using the buzzwords, but actually telling you how they brought that to life. So a much more practical approach to understanding how behavioural economics can play a part in your thinking and your execution of strategy. And so this chapter is all about how some of the elements of behavioural economics go beyond creating awareness and information and start to engage and help people adapt behaviours. There's all sorts of strategies there for applying behavioural economics to communications, but I think it's an interesting chapter that really starts to say, okay, now we're looking at behavioural economics in practice, looking at it from the perspective of effectiveness. So not just talking about it as a nice buzzword, but actually starting to play it out in real strategies and real behaviours for brands. So some of the things that you really strike you when you look at the papers through the lens of behavioural economics are things like the real clarity of purpose behind the stories, particularly things like the Transport for London, where there's such a granular data-led approach to understanding exactly how to move and shift behaviours to avoid the kind of Olympic travel car crash that I think they'd seen was a potential on the horizon. And there's also interesting case, Dacia's a good one, where you kind of really see a rediscovery of the power of positioning and the framing of choice. And Dacia was a low budget car, all the fancy gadgets stripped out of it, a really basic price point. That's quite a hard sell in a market where the convention is the more gizmos, the better the car. And I think their strategy, was really interesting way of reframing that, using a new way of judging how cars and the value intrinsic in cars with their idea about you do the maths. So again, it underpins the idea of framing and positioning and the power of positioning. There was also a number of cases that were really great examples of heuristics, so rules of thumb. One of those being the British Heart Foundation, the Vinnie campaign. I don't know, you probably all remember, where you're kind of doing it in time to the Staying Alive music. That's a brilliant example of using a rule of thumb in order to change behaviour. And also the fire campaign, which was about checking your batteries, your smoke alarm batteries when the clocks change, is another brilliant example of that. So you start to see this whole series of campaigns really not just talking about behavioural economics, but actually bringing those things to life. And it's going to be really exciting and interesting to see where that goes moving forward. And interestingly, we also saw some echoes of that coming through in the way the client was starting to think about how they managed their communication planning and their business. And one of the examples of that was with Everest, which took on the philosophy that Dave Brailsford had put into place at Sky of the 1% changes. So they looked at their whole campaign and media planning process and tried to find the 1% difference in terms of driving greater effectiveness and efficiency. So those nudges, those small nudges, all added up to something big. And again, that's another key behavioural economics principle. The next chapter is really reflecting on, there's a whole series of campaigns which really did leverage fame in one way or another. And this chapter really helps us start to understand what some of the best practices for that strategy would be. And also starts to reflect on what, it's easy to go, look at some of the findings and say, well, fame seems to be where the business effects are. Everything we have to do is famous. And I think it's interesting to reflect that it's actually more difficult for certain brands and certain businesses to adopt that as a strategy as it is for others. And some of the things that you see kind of coming out of this arena is how important it is to think about ideas that can bridge cultures and actually take on a vernacular. And one of the greatest examples and a really interesting case study from this year is the Specsavers. You should have gone to Specsavers. It's something you might hear, people shouting at the ref in a football match, for instance. It's a great example of creating assets and collateral that can bridge from brand culture to being owned by the popular culture, and those are really important. And I think that's the same. You can see the same there being enacted by the British Heart Foundation. It's a really sticky idea. It not only is strategically bang on in terms of what they wanted to achieve, but it's done in a really super engaging way that actually earns the attention of the audience. I think one of the other themes that came through from the famed driving campaigns, you'll see some other examples here, like the Sainsbury's, the EDF Zingy and the First Direct campaign there at the bottom, is the use of topicality. And you can see using certain celebrities or particular music tracks allow a brand to play into topicality, and even actually playing that into events that are happening in and around at the time. You can see that echoing in certain accounts. So creating currency, leveraging currency is obviously really important. And the final point is you can really see it doesn't just happen by accident. In a lot of these cases, certainly as they're presented, people set out to chase after fame in some respects. So again, really interesting about strategically, can you plan for fame? And these are some great examples of campaigns which have delivered that. So what can we learn from them? The next theme was about global marketing, and actually this year this sprang out of a debate that happened in the judging room, which was how hard is it to put together a case, a really cohesive case about a multi-market campaign. How difficult that is, both in terms of finding the right kind of data, but correlating activities. There's so much fragmentation in the way brands are behaving across cultural and geographical borders. It becomes really hard to put together a cohesive effectiveness story, and I think that's a challenge that the judges observed, and something I think that we've got to take on and talk about as an industry. How do you actually balance local and global brand governance? How do you use branding to reduce risk? What is the value of global branding? And how do you approach it? And three of the cases here are Expedia with their Travel Yourself Interesting, which was a really interesting case in itself, EasyJet, and Only Jeans too was a multi-market campaign. And some of the things that emerged from that were really how storytelling, again, was really key to those. So Only Jeans, again, literally took that through its storytelling. But actually one of the key things was about, the danger is you start to think too granular, and there's actually underpinning these ideas an insight that is really human. So take, for example, the Expedia, the insight there that holidays are much these days about content and bragging rights as they are about where you're actually going and what you're actually doing. So that is a really basic, fundamental human insight, but it's relevant whether you live in France, whether you live in Germany. It's relevant to whomever, wherever. So the power of a core insight, I think, was really underpinned by these. And the same with EasyJet, with their understanding about Generation EasyJet and about how it frees people up to live a more spontaneous life. There was also some detailed stuff came out of this, which are covered in the chapter, which is about the power of segmentation and also the use of ground-up thinking. So how do you actually engage and integrate local insight into a globalized strategy? And also a cycle of performance and pruning, which I think EasyJet's a really good example of how they constantly were striving through this story to find opportunities to create efficiency. I think overall, though, the key thing from these multi-market campaigns is that a belief that comes through is this belief in the power of a brand, rooted in an insight that can actually help you transcend borders. And I think that's a great story for us moving forward, that even if it is, the difficulties of measurement remain, they're a challenge we've got to face, because actually the benefits to businesses of having brands that can span a global marketplace is going to continue to be relevant. So these stories, I think, are really important as kind of exemplars of doing that. The next area that emerged was, again, another area that came out of the debates that were happening in the judging room, and that was around econometrics. And there was a huge debate in the room. Some of the papers, as usual, used econometrics, and some of the papers didn't, and it was roughly the same proportions as been seen in the past. But I think there was a reflection about how you take econometric outputs and translate them into usable, actionable strategy for an audience that aren't necessarily sort of versed in the detail of statistics and how the models are put together. And I think there were some interesting questions about how can econometrics move with the times, and how can we make sure that the industry as a whole has enough understanding to enable us to unlock and really appreciate the balance, the delicate balance of qualitative, subjective inputs into modelling as well as the science, and recognise that actually it is a mix of a human input as well as a mathematical process. And so I think there was all sorts of opportunities there for us to think about not just thinking about, I think a lot of businesses think of econometrics just as a media mix approach. Actually, how do you apply that and understand the value of social media as part of that, and how do you understand the impact of creative and messaging, and allow econometrics to help us really explore all those dimensions, when obviously we all understand how complex things have got with, you know, campaign planning these days. So again, this is a whole area up for discussion and debate as we move forward, and I know the IPA is working to make sure that the awards really reflect the absolute current debates and questions, and really ensure that everybody understands the absolute value that econometrics can add to the mix. Another theme that came through by sheer number of cases was about new product launches, and there's a whole series of cases here, from Dacia to McCain's with their microwavable jackets, for instance, and our window vacs, all kinds of novel products. So the chapter here is really a discussion about risk, about what does a consumer risk when they move into a new product category, whether that's the cost of learning a new behaviour or the cost of losing a familiar or tried and trusted way of solving a particular problem. I think it's also interesting, these papers help you understand how to create that wantability in very different ways. So the McCain's example there, their strategy centred on a highly kind of sensory stimulating campaign, both in terms of media and creative, and it was all about kind of getting the juices flowing. Whereas, for example, Sensodyne Pro Namel was about creating wantability by establishing there was a problem. So acid erosion wasn't something that anybody had really come across before. So you can see different ways that each one of these brands has created that wantability. And one of the things that we pulled out when we were talking about these cases in terms of storytelling was about the use of simplicity as a strategic tool. So actually, because some of these products are novel and bringing something quite interesting and different to a marketplace, they actually have adopted a very simple approach in a lot of ways, whether you see that creatively or in terms of media, for instance. So it's not to be frightened of, if your product is disruptive, of being simple. And I think one of the things that always comes through from new product launches is how each one of those businesses is able to reflect on that launch as being a platform for growth, not just by allowing you to sell more of that particular product, but providing you with a bridge into another marketplace. And Karsha, for example, had been an outdoor product, and now through this they're starting to build a bridge into being an internal product, which might open the door to all sorts of new opportunities. So content was another great theme. It's a big kind of topic area in the industry about using, creating ideas that people can engage with, as opposed to advertising it's ideas worth advertising. And so there were a whole series of cases here, from Mercedes to Deutsche Telekom to even, you could see the Aldi Swap and Save campaign in a way as being some form of content. And it's content that takes brand engagement beyond the idea of interruption to providing something of use or of interest to its audience. And I think what was interesting from the cases we've got here is they all play different tunes. Some of it's about content that's about utility, some of it's about content that's about pure entertainment. And you can see how content can play so many different roles. But what's great here is that it starts to show that the business effect that can sit behind those campaigns. One thing to note, though, was that very clearly they're still highly reliant on audience creation, and advertising and communication in its more traditional sense was being used far more as a trailer for that content. So actually that content can't survive without some form of broadcast, push broadcast support. And finally, not-for-profit, and what is known in many arenas as social marketing or marketing for social good was founded on the principles of taking commercial marketing practices and applying it to behaviour change for the good of society. And it's quite interesting to reverse that now and say, okay, what can we as commercial practitioners learn from the not-for-profit sector? And there's all sorts of examples and campaigns. As with all the IPA awards, there's always some really interesting not-for-profit cases and some great learnings there. And I think in particular this year was a real testament to the rigour of objective setting and piloting, and really using some of the limitations that you have in terms of budget as being a liberator, something that forces you to be creative in a totally different way. And there's some great examples there, from the pancreatic cancer campaign's use of shock tactics to the humanitarian attention campaign for demobilisation, which again used media in a really interesting way. So that kind of gives you a quick overview of some of the chapters and where they come from, and reflects on very briefly on some of the cases. But you might sort of say, well, how do we expect you to use this book? And I think, you know, at its most simplest, it's inspiration. You know, you can sit down with a brief in front of you and go, well, what if I did an EasyJet on this? Or what if I did a Specsavers? What would that mean? What might that mean for the way I behave? And it can be really powerful. And I think the way I see it is creativity is very rarely coming up with something completely new. Actually, creativity is about putting two ideas together that have never been put together before. And I think what this does in terms of reading these cases is you're almost populating your brain with a whole rich palette of colours, of new ideas, new strategies. But the important thing is these are the effective ones. So if you can absorb and sponge in all these examples, all these stories, all these bits of creative wizardry, all these strategic turning points, when you actually come to sit down with your challenge in front of you, you'll have more colours from which to paint a solution. And so that, for me, is the real benefit of reading these case studies. You'll find they'll bubble up, and you'll be in a meeting 6 months later and you'll go, God, that's just like so-and-so when they did that. And not only will you look brilliant, but you'll have something really useful there to use. So thank you very much. What we're going to do now is we're going to move on and have a look at one of the films. I'm sure you might have some questions on the book, but we can come back to that. So it's the 10th year that we've had the partnership between the IPA and the Think Box. And what they've done brilliantly is take some of those case studies and turn them into films. And these films bring to life the stories that we've got into little bite-sized documentaries. And actually, each one is roughly about 15 minutes long. So they're brilliant sort of coffee break, kind of, again, feeding your brain. And it's a really rare chance, I think, to engage and hear the voices that went behind some of the stories. So we can see the charts and we can read the backstory. But there's a great opportunity to actually look into the eyes of the people that were facing that problem and gain some inspiration from them directly. And in celebration of the awards this year, we've got a fresh set of films. And tonight we're going to show you the first one, which is the Foster's campaign by adam&eveDDB. There are lots more to come, and they're going to be published through a series of masterclass series as we move forward in the year. We've got Specsavers coming up. We've got EasyJet by VCCP and OMD. We've got the Mercedes case, so some really interesting stories, really good inspiration to share within your organisation. And there's also a film which covers some of the new product learnings, where we're going to look at Dacia, McCain, Centodyne, and look at those in a bit more detail. It gives us great pleasure to have Toby here to talk to us in much more detail about some of the thinking and the insights and the background to that particular case study. Toby actually took his research for working on Foster's really seriously, but not only part being Australian, but going over there to work for 10 years. So, you know, he's come back with a whole raft full of awards and now wins the Grand Prix Effectiveness Award. So he absolutely makes you sick. So I'd like to invite him up to come and share his insights, and I'm sure we'll all kind of press him with really difficult questions afterwards. So a round of applause for Toby.
G'day. It's quite funny when you see yourself on a big screen. I hadn't realised quite how furry I was. but nonetheless a handsome devil. It's quite unusual sort of sitting through that film and then trying to talk to you about, what essentially has just been told there. I was sat last night kind of scratching my head going, what the bloody hell can I tell you guys that you probably don't already know? And then it suddenly dawned on me this morning that the book hasn't been released yet, so you haven't actually seen the case study, so at least I can tell you a bit of that, and then maybe you should still buy it nonetheless, because it's a really good book. I had a quick look through it. Okay, so how do I tell you a story about a Dutch company that wanted to flog an Australian beer brand to English blokes? It's a really odd, crazy story, this one, and there's a really lovely quote I came across a little while ago, which was, the farther backwards you look, the farther forwards you can actually see. And Winston Churchill was right. Now, what I wanted to do, if I was going to teach you anything today, was a few Australian sayings, so I've got a couple of these. The first one is, this was an environment that was tougher than a woodpecker's lips. It was an absolute nightmare to be a beer brand in 2010. And I know Lindsay, our client, had a bit of a chat about it. She was saying, it was pretty tricky. That's only half the story. So 2 years before, the global financial crisis hit, and most people would say, generally booze brands do all right in a depression. Well, actually, we didn't, because there were a whole load of other factors that were contributing to this. So yes, there were austerity measures being put in place, but also at the same time, there was a massively aging population, there was smoking bans being put in force, and in addition to a whole load of EU duty excise issues, we were seeing about 30 pubs a week in 2010 closing. So it was a really, really tough time to be a booze brand. In addition to this, the on-trade, so anywhere that's kind of a pub or a club that sells booze, was seeing a decline in all volume as well by about 18%. Now, just to put that as a kind of stat that you can get your hand around, 18% is basically taking the top 2 lager brands in the country and just wiping them off. Okay, so at that time, everything was going bananas. So by 2010, the number of pubs in the UK had fallen to the lowest number since the 1950s. So pretty much the places that you could get your product into people's hands on a regular basis was dwindling and dwindling and dwindling. And if that wasn't bad enough, we were also seeing that the majority of our target audience, which is 18 to 34-year-old blokes, were visiting the pubs less and less frequently. In fact, about 40% of the target that we were going after were visiting pubs weekly. So that meant more than half of all the people that we were trying to get our product in the hands of weren't actually going to the main place that they could engage with it. This is the other pretty scary statistic. So the excise duty across EU members, we're the second highest, just behind Finland, which is a pretty depressing place to go to. If it's not dark enough, it's really expensive for grog. But that's a staggering statistic. So it just shows you, when everyone's a little bit hurting in the wallet, it's hurting even more to go down to the pub and pay the price of a pint. And then cider. It had turned into a leviathan. It was going bonkers. Cider, when I left this country, was kind of what you drank underneath a tree when you wanted to get pissed when you were 16. By the time I came back, it had a new name. People were calling it Cidra, and it was pretty fancy, and it came in fruit flavours, not just for the ladies. It was like a proper decent bloke drink. Madness. So we had this huge explosion of other brands and other categories trying to cut our mustard. If it wasn't cider, suddenly it was okay for blokes to drink wine. And if they weren't drinking wine, they were having spirits and all kinds of other fancy stuff as well. So, for a poor old Aussie beer brand like Foster's, it was looking pretty tough. Now, these are the hideous stats that we were facing up to in 2010. So the whole lager market was in decline. Pretty bad, slope going to the right. Including in this pretty unpretty picture was the fact that our brand was losing market share as well. So we're in this horrible state of double jeopardy. Small market, getting smaller, and then our brand getting smaller still. So going backwards at twice the speed. We got briefed in 2010 by Heineken to basically see if we could try and get the brand back on track. Now, any pitch is a pretty scary time. You know, you kind of go through the ringer of all kinds of emotions as you're going through the process. But the really scary part about this pitch was there was only 12 weeks until the World Cup kicked off in South Africa, which is pretty much the biggest volume opportunity that you're going to get as a lager brand over a 4-year window. So whatever the output was of this pitch was going to get made and translated into work in about 12 weeks' time. So we had to come up with something pretty fast, pretty good, that was going to get a big share of throat in 12 weeks' time. And that kind of made us look really, really hard backwards at what the brand was great at before. And back in the day, in the 80s, when this brand genuinely was great, it had something about it. In fact, this was a brand that was a rooster one day, and it turned into a feather duster the next. We had one of the greatest ads of the 20th century. So this Foster's Ballet spot was voted in the top 10 most loved ads of the 2000s. The 20th century. So this was the moment when the brand was on the map. It suddenly arrived. It was a genuine export that was doing brilliantly here, and it had tapped into an amazing sense of what you could connect to with a British male drinker. But after the Paul Hogan era, things started to get a bit funky, and we got some pretty odd stuff coming out, if I'm honest. This weird robot ad, like the Japanese dude gets a robot, you know, he thinks it's going to do domestic chores, and then he finds out it's in bed with the Hoover because it drinks Foster's. That was pretty weird. There was a whole thing about people going and collecting shadows. I've got no idea what that was about. And then even DDB made some pretty stinky ones with Burt Lancaster. I wasn't around for those though. So, and then there was this kind of slightly creepy truck driver guy who was probably going to bury you and kill you and, you know, stick you somewhere in the outback, which happens. So yeah, it was a pretty odd time, and the brand had genuinely lost its way. You know, it was in this weird state of flux. You know, it was still a big lager brand. You know, it was ranged in loads of places, but no one really had a sense of what it was about. There was a lot of really exciting, interesting other lagers that were coming in from Europe. You know, there was exotic lagers from Asia. We just didn't really have a reason to be on the agenda for young guys. So it was at this point in 2010 as well that Heineken made a very, very significant business decision as well, and a very, very big strategic one for them. So recognizing that there was a very particular issue with what was going on in the on-trade, so pubs, clubs closing, hardly anyone's going drinking at them, no one wants to spend money at them because it's really expensive. They just decided to put their entire business focus into the off-trade, so supermarkets, off-licenses, anywhere that you could buy drinks and consume them off-premises. So at this point, they decided they were going to put some shoulder into pricing up the tinnies. Now, the point here was they wanted to chase profitable growth for the brand. And by profitable growth, what this meant was they weren't just going to go into the supermarkets and go, we're going to help you out, we're going to take big hits, deep discounts, we'll do whatever it takes to get ranged. They couldn't do that. They couldn't afford to do that. There was no way that they were going to get any sense of profitable growth. So they made a very focused effort, and they were briefing us to say, we've got to put this into supermarkets and we've got to maintain price. Now, supermarkets are the most evil judge of brand strength that you will find. If you don't have a solid brand, they'll put you on the discount merry-go-round and they'll throw you around trying to drag people in, get you to buy them, get them to buy you with someone else, and then basically you just end up with a huge erosion of your pricing, your market share, your volume, etc. So that was the environment that we were going into. It was a pretty scary place. We were going to be up against some of the big players and some really interesting, exciting movers and shakers. So at this time, cider was starting to cut huge swathes of what those aisles were looking like. So we had to warrant a genuine reason for being there. Now, one of my colleagues, a little bloke called Les, who's here, it's nice to see him, he did a bit of work with a guy called Peter Field, and I'm pretty sure he's right, that brand building is the key to lower price sensitivity. If you have a brand that people value, they will pay for it. So I, along with him and a whole host of other people at Adam and Eve, were very, very heartened by the fact that we knew that we could do this job and we could sew up what the supermarket and off-trade opportunity was going to be about if we could establish a decent brand and establish an emotional connection with our audience. So our job was going to be, how the hell were we going to reconnect with a group of young blokes who were feeling flatter than a lizard out drinking? Now, what I meant by this is actually young blokes were having a pretty tough time. And we found this out because we did something really, really unusual. And I'll be honest, I haven't done this before. I've done it a few times since, but we paid people to listen in on our target. We didn't do natural research the way that you did. You know, we're kind of in a pitch situation, which meant we had to be a bit more ingenious and think about things slightly differently. So as well as going out to loads of pubs and kind of trying to listen in on young guys drinking, the young guys who actually were there, we got a whole load of bar staff, and we said to them, right, here's a couple of dockets, just write down what the guys are talking about. We'll give you a couple of quid at the end of every night. It was like a 20 quid incentive if they had a decent docket on it. And we started to hear some really interesting stuff recurring. So the first thing that started to come up was generally young blokes were feeling pretty bad about the whole way that culture was looking at them. They were generally pretty disappointed that they'd been demonized as youth. So at this time, it was pretty easy to see why, but they weren't feeling particularly liked or loved by everyone else in culture. And at this time as well, there'd been 30 years since when Foster's had been a really, really great powerhouse brand. Well, the young blokes had changed a hell of a lot since then. You know, the backslapping beer bravado that had coloured most advertising was really alien to them, and it didn't make any sense. In fact, the tribal drinkers, so the young guys that we were going after, over 70% of these guys felt that there were no accurate portrayals of who they were in any type of media that they were seeing. They were either being stereotyped as some kind of bumbling boyfriend or a lager lout or some kind of hoodie yob. And they were pretty disappointed by it. Additionally, they had some pretty serious concerns as well, and they were dealing with a lot. They had like kind of this transitional period where they were stopping being men and stopping being boys and starting to be men. And they were starting to worry about stuff, you know, worry about it in a really real and visceral way. You know, they had the obvious concerns about, you know, how the hell do I get abs like a Men's Health cover model that I'm seeing every single week? But also, how the hell am I going to, you know, set fire to my career? It seems like everyone can just invent something that you can put on the interwebs and suddenly get rich and famous. What the hell am I going to do? How do I juggle the fact that I'm a young bloke and I'm trying to get a career at the same time? And then also they were getting into pretty serious relationship issues as well. You know, I've met this girl, she's pretty nice. If I move in with her, are my mates dead to me? You know, what does it really mean? Is it forever? Also, a lot of these guys were still living at home with their parents, and their relationship with their parents had changed pretty drastically. You know, they were trying to wrestle with the fact that they suddenly had housemates who were old, who had loads of pictures of them when they were kids in the bath. You know, it was a pretty tricky dynamic. So these guys were kind of in a really weird space in their life, and what we noticed pretty quickly was the way that they helped each other through their bonding sessions, through the time that they caught up, was really, really useful to them, because their mates were the only people that they felt comfortable kind of assuaging or talking about the angst that they had in their lives. You know, they wouldn't tell anyone else this stuff, but you got a couple of pints into them and suddenly the floodgates opened and they started talking about their relationship issues, you know, their worries about whether they were going to look good enough in their swimming trunks coming up in the summer. You know, there was a really interesting dynamic that was at play amongst blokes. Now, the interesting piece around this though is, yes, guys were helping each other. Yes, guys were helping soothe their anxieties. But it wasn't like steel magnolias. You know, they weren't all sitting around a few candles. The dynamic that these guys had around how they were actually portraying these kind of absolving moments was hugely, hugely charged by energy, banter, taking the piss out of each other, and kind of making it a humorous exercise. So, yeah, you've got issues, no problem. Let's dial them up, make fun of you, and then help you get through that process in a kind of cathartic way. And this was a really, really important moment for us, that we suddenly realized, yeah, we could possibly have found the one thing that's really interesting about this group, which is they've got issues and no one else is talking about blokes in the way that they really are. But the really critical piece for us was if we were going to talk about their issues, we had to do it in a humorous way that they would recognise and actually accept. So we thought hard about what we could offer them as a brand. And being Australian was the only thing really at the heart of the Foster's brand that we could tap into. But when we look back to the old Australia, it was great. But the Oz right now was a nation with the reputation of a raw prawn in the sun. That's a bad thing, in case you don't know. It goes off really quick and it's pretty stinky. Now, I'd grown up in a time when Neighbours, Home and Away, all of the colour of what Australia really was being beamed into my living room every lunchtime when I was probably meant to be at lectures. And I had a really good sense of what Australia was, but these guys were a lot younger and they had a very different sense of what Australia was about. In fact, when we tried to understand what the best bits of Australia were for these guys, we didn't get any of the semiotics that we kind of expected. We thought, yeah, this is a country of bronze surf gods, and they're all amazing athletic dudes who are just really chilled out and cool. But actually it wasn't true at all. In fact, in the wake of the Cronulla riots, pretty much the only thing that people were saying about Australians were they were dumb, drunk and racist. In fact, it was pretty bad. Anyone who thought anything about Australia weren't particularly excited about going there because it was a country filled with everything that would kill you on land. And then if you decided to get off the land and go into the water, you'd get killed too. I mean, it's a horrendous place. I don't know why I stayed there for so long. It's really awesome. There's none of this stuff there. It's pretty good, except massive spiders that are in your bathroom. They're as big as your hand. Terrifying. Okay, and they weren't even very good at cricket anymore. That was the really interesting bit. We couldn't even play on the fact that they were better than us at sport. So, my colleague Sarah Carter has this really interesting perspective on what brilliant beer advertising does. And she said, the best beer advertising always gives you an emotional free sample of what the product is. And that's a really, really important point for us because we thought if we had to really understand what the emotional free sample was that we were giving, we had to understand what the best part of our brand was. And Australia's best export had always been the sunny, optimistic attitude of, she'll be right, mate. And what she'll be right, mate is just a kind of no worries, laid back, relaxed approach to life. In fact, it's so entrenched in Australian culture that if you still today ask people what the very best dynamics of Australian people are, they'll always say they're laid back, relaxed and chilled out. It's amazing. It keeps coming up all the time. It seems that Crocodile Dundee has done the best branding job for Australia ever. It's still working now. In fact, these guys have such a positive, optimistic approach to life. Everything in their culture is brilliant, even when it's a bit shit. I mean, this is a country where the $1 coin is bigger than the $2 coin, so you can feel a bit better about it when it's in your hand, okay? It's an amazing place. So we kind of thought, hang on a sec, we might have been able to unlock the emotional energy that's in this brand around this no worries, carefree spirit. And I wonder if we could couple this no worries, carefree spirit and use it in a way that could actually absolve these issues that the guys in the UK had. Maybe, just maybe, we might have something that could be pretty powerful. And what we found was a really, really clever way to epitomise and embody everything that was great about that Australian no worry spirit. And we found it in these two guys. So I know we said in the film, the casting process was a really critical piece, but I can't labour this enough, that the great idea of providing an agony uncle service that was an umbilical cord to the UK drinkers and establishing this lovely world of sunny optimism only being a phone call away, and then in these personas was utterly, utterly brilliant. They weren't bronzed Aussie gods. They were a slightly tubby, dark-haired guy and a bloke who's a bit scruffy and has too tight shirts. But these guys were pretty normal, very, very kind of avuncular. They were like our Australian cousins who were just there, who in the spirit of mateship wanted to help out and lend a hand to these particularly troubled drinkers that we had in the UK. I have to admit, when we first rolled the dice on these ads, I know everyone was a little bit scared. I know Ben said he had dynamite and he was really happy and he just couldn't wait to put them on there. But there was a few buttock clenching moments of just going, how the hell is this thing going to go? But the truth is, it went off like a frog in a sock. You know, it was an absolute rip snorter for us. And one of the first awesome charts that I want to show you, they're awesome because Les made them, they're brilliant, are in total brand communications awareness. As soon as we went on air, that's where the green line goes down and the blue line goes up, we started to see that people were recognizing our communications. They were starting to connect with it. The brand started to be on the lips of our target. Suddenly, we had a bit of energy about us, and we were starting to see it translate into sales. Finally, there was a beer brand that actually had communication that people wanted to talk about. I mean, it's probably not as good as the Hofmeister beer, but you know, it felt like there was an energy around beer advertising again that people were interested in and wanted to talk about, and it started to resonate with culture. We also had a brand that people thought was doing good advertising. Now that's a bit of a killer. When people actually like what you're doing in advertising, it's usually a pretty positive sign, but when you're talking about beer, which is meant to be a recreational activity, you know, this is a really, really important factor. And people responded to it as well. You know, the amazing thing about social media is you can get a really good, quick read on what you're doing and whether people like it or not. So Dan Sibley, Andrew Whitehead, and David Bowen, I don't know any of these guys, but they really liked the work and they weren't afraid to tell us as well. And we had a 700% rise in search traffic towards our YouTube page. So we didn't just make content, stick it out there and kind of hope for the best and hope that it was affecting people. People actually started to seek out the content. They really loved the ads and they wanted to go and find them for themselves. Now, the sales got going like a mad lady's arm in the custard is probably the weirdest of all of these phrases, but it's about making custard. That's what it's meant to mean. So yeah, we started churning the sales really, really well. Now, the interesting piece around this was we got to be the #1 brand pretty much straight after the campaign broke. You know, we had a very hard-hitting, very good piece of work that started transitioning into sales fast. The amazing thing about working in a category like the beer category is the data is so rich that you can start to see the power of what you're doing very, very quickly. And the really nice thing is we didn't do this by innovating our way out of trouble. It wasn't like we suddenly went, crikey, no one really likes our product, we better make a different one, you know, and try and satisfy the need that they have for premium beers, etc. That wasn't the case. We knew that we had a bit of a problem with the brand, so we went back and fixed the core. And because we fixed the core first and we got ourselves into a shape that made us fit to fight and people liked us, we had the ability to grow our brand and then extend it into the NPD and carry that momentum forwards into a new brand extension that people were already predisposed to wanting to like. Now, that brand strength was reflected when it came to supermarkets and when it came to the off-trade. The really important piece that we wanted was to deliver profitable growth, and we didn't do it by gouging out any of our prices or dropping our pants with retailers and saying, sure, drop us, put us on the merry-go-round. In fact, during the whole time that we were on air, we started to see amazing emotional connection with the brand that drove price, because suddenly, although we hadn't changed the product, and although we hadn't done anything new to it, and we weren't putting it in new places, our communication suddenly changed the way people felt about it. You know, the emotional connection made them think, actually, this liquid's higher quality. I actually think this brand is better than other brands. And actually, it appeals to me more than other brands. And we had staggering lifts in this compared to everyone else in the category. Also, that connection allowed us to drive the price elasticity as well. So between 2010 and 2013, we managed to increase the average price year on year. We didn't take hits. We carried the momentum through. And this is something that I'm particularly proud of, is the brand strength being able to translate into power in the off-trade is a really critical part of why this is such a good story. So TV, I will admit, has been one of the really important factors in this brand's success. Ben Priest said earlier in the video, he said, it's a real campaign because it's lasted for a while, it's big, it's populist, and it's funny. It's populist primarily because we had an amazing medium that was hugely emotional and could deliver the reach that we needed to do this. So I have to admit that TV has been a really critical driving force of delivering the energy that we wanted on this brand. And it's been working its socks off for us. So over the years that the IPA has been measuring effectiveness on beer brands, we went back to 92, and the revenue generated per dollar spent, this campaign is by far and away the greatest. And what this means is, in a time when there's a lot of proliferation of different media that you can use, it shows that really good, honest, traditional media applied in the right way with really good craft can actually deliver brilliantly. You can thank me later, the Thinkbox guys, but it is an amazing story. Okay, I'm going to do a little bit of pissing in the pockets of the diggers that did it now, because I've only been the custodian of the Foster's brand for a couple of years, but there's some really amazing people who, A, made it possible for this paper to get out there, and B, actually made the campaign possible. So the first one is Ben Priest. He's a creative genius, and he leveraged an amazing creative department to get a great idea into the form that you guys have seen it. But there's three other people that I'd like to say a quick thank you to. So Sarah Carter, who co-piloted me through how to write one of these papers. She's done masses of these, and there's no way I could have written it without her support. And then there's Les, who cracked the whip on me to make sure that I actually wrote it. He told me that I've never had an IPA paper with less than 17 drafts, so I made sure I did 39, just to kind of like excel. So there's probably going to be some poor young guys who are going to have to write 39 now at DB. But he was an absolute genius, so thanks Les, you've been a massive help to me getting this out here. And then there's DG as well, so he was the genuine strategic genius behind all of this. And he doesn't really like to come to these things. He doesn't like the limelight. He's a bit of a misanthrope at the best of times, but he's a very, very smart chap. It's his baby. It's a brilliant campaign, and I'm very lucky to have been able to touch it. So I just wanted to say cheers to the IPA, Anya. Hope you like it. I'm very fond of the work. It's a nice set of ads that did a bloody good job for a good brand.
You have to sit in the
Oh,
comedy
right.
chair. So
The wobbly one.
Yeah, the wobbly. I hope you haven't had too much wine.
Okay.
So we thought it'd be useful. We've probably got about 10 minutes left. I'm sure everybody's starving. If you want to ask any questions, now is the time. Does anybody have any questions they want to ask Toby?
I've sat down now.
One thing that struck me is the story of the pitch and how that kind of unfolded into execution. What do you think were the kind of key decision points or turning points that you saw when you were going through that process that led you to that success? Whereas in maybe other cases you might have turned left when you should have turned right. Were there any kind of key moments where you sat down? Can you tell us a bit more about how that?
From what I understand about the process, I think the big learning for me about this whole case study is it's a remarkably good classic advertising story. And I think Adam and Eve and adam&eveDDB have got a very methodical way of doing pitching, and I think it's just about making sure the basics are applied really, really well. And I've often said to DG, I said, is it more important to be wrong early and kind of figure things out, or right really late? And he's always said to me, it's most important to be right really late. And what he meant by this is, if you don't have a really, really good insight, if you don't have a brilliant creative catalyst, if you don't have all of your ducks in a row in terms of what the problem is, what you're really trying to fix, then it's very, very hard to get to the right answer. And he said it doesn't matter if it happens the night before, but it's just got to happen in the right order. So my view on this is doing a really interesting type of research project, like the one that was undertaken here, was the real circuit breaker on this. We suddenly found something that no one else had, and we understood the way these guys were thinking and how they were feeling about how everyone else was seeing them. Suddenly started to open some doors, and thankfully we actually found that relatively early, so we could really explore it and move through it creatively. I think that's the kind of the keystone moment in the story, if there is one.
Okay. The question at the back?
So you know what you know now. Would you have done anything differently? Are there any levers you could have, with hindsight, lent on a little bit to make it even more effective? Are you more Brad or Dan?
I'm definitely the good-looking one, and I don't know if anyone knows which one's Brad and which one's Dan. But,
It's like Ant and Dec.
Brad, yeah, Ant or Dec, I don't know.
Yeah.
Brad's the blonde one, and Dan's the dark-haired one. That's the only way I can remember it. What would I have done differently? To be honest, not a whole heap. I think it's kind of weird. Once this campaign got moving, it almost had a life of its own, and the only thing that I think we probably, looking back over the last couple of years, is we haven't capitalised enough on the moments where little bits of what we started to throw out into the world were taking seed in culture. So we did a weird little ad last year about the paddle of rebuke, and it was when a couple of guys were, you know, chewing your ear off about the economic downturn, what you could do to kind of stymie that conversation, and they made this little paddle, and suddenly, like, we were starting to see loads of people on social media had made their own and were using them, and I just don't think we gave enough fuel to the fire around things that people were doing with our brands and being comfortable enough to kind of give the reins over to the brands. But that's a pretty common gripe with most brand custodians at the moment. The only other thing I would have done is I probably would have come over earlier and tried to steal a bit more thunder from DG on it. That's it.
Hard act to follow,
Yeah.
definitely. Is there any other questions?
Sorry, think box dominated. So it's no surprise to me at all that TV worked incredibly powerfully. But what I'm slightly surprised at is, did you not get any pushback from Heineken about, you know, you're pitching for the business and you're saying, right, we're going to come up with an incredibly traditional campaign, which we're going to do really good telly, very traditional media. Didn't you have a sort of query about that at some point in the pitch and think, well, actually, maybe we need to do something a bit more innovative? Or didn't the client say that?
I think there's probably there's a bit from column A and a bit from column B to this answer. So one is Heineken as an advertiser has a particular model to the way that they work as a marketeer. And I think we probably pitched a little bit on the safe side to ensure that we satisfied. However, there was a lot of really non-traditional components to what we did deliver when the campaign went live that actually kind of really brought it to life. So there was a column in Shortlist magazine where these guys, you know, were actually delivering on an agony uncle service in real time. There was a brilliant website that kind of allowed people to connect and bring their mates into the story, and it was driven through social media. So there's a lot of components that you probably haven't seen or haven't been surfaced. If you buy the book, they're all in there, by the way, in the case study, so you can definitely see it, because I remember writing about them. But yeah, there's a lot of parts to it that are great. But I do genuinely, and you have to take this, you know, as honest truth. I've been, for a long time, one of the sternest advocates of modern advertising and making sure you think out of the box and definitely trying to deliver non-traditional approaches. But this is the one, you know, case study that has made me genuinely reappraise the power of traditional advertising or classic advertising done in a brilliant way. And I think when you have a great idea and a great idea that's manifested beautifully in a medium that was made to deliver it, it's very, very hard to look at it and go, yeah, but what's your Twitter hashtag strategy that goes with this? So that's my answer to it.
Any other questions? One thing that struck me was, there's a one at the back, sorry. Yeah.
Listening to you talk about young men was like being psychoanalyzed, actually. Why do you think it took, why has no one come up with something as similar as that for young people? Why has no one done that kind of research for young men before you guys did it? Why do you think that?
Why do you think? I don't know. You know, it's a weird one. It's one of those kind of, it's so obvious. I don't know how anyone didn't think about it before, but I think it's just a kind of, well, you sit there in a meeting room and you go, maybe we should do this, and someone actually goes and does it and it pays dividends. Quite a lot of the time we always say, oh yeah, we should do that, or we could definitely give this a go, and things end up falling by the wayside because they're a little bit too difficult or they're kind of tricky. I think in the middle of a pitch situation where you ask a couple of the young account guys, do you mind going out to the boozer, seeing what blokes are talking about and slipping a 20 quid note to a few barmaids to get them to write notes on things? It was just a no-brainer. It was like, yep, I'll put my hand up for that, I'll go for it. So I don't know, it's part circumstance. part dumb luck, and part we just gave it a go.
I think often great insight hides in plain sight, and I think it's a really great example of strategic detective work, getting out there and really touching things and not relying on the pen portrait and the things that get fed through, the usual channels.
I'm a big believer in this. If you want to find insight, it's a high contact sport. You have to go out and rub up against real people physically. Like, you can't just do this.
No,
through
you're not
Google.
supposed to do that.
You're not
totally.
supposed to do it. But it's always richer. It's always better. It's always more real when it comes from a real place. And there's no amount of Mintel, and there's no amount of kind of data streams that you can tap into that are as good as I was in a cafe the other day and I've heard a bloke talking about this, or I was in the biscuit aisle at Tesco's and I suddenly noticed that Mum was doing that. And it just makes it real. It makes it visceral and tangible.
It's quite striking the way you talked, Lorna, at the beginning about stories, and so much of this story seems to be about pitch, and in a way how focusing, how intense that experience is, how all the great people are there in the age, how you have to come up with something expedient like let's go to the pub and just listen to some people rather than let's do something more conventional. So I just wondered how much of the story, and you've talked a lot about it being a pitch, but how much of the success of the whole thing and how much of the discovery of the insight and this the whole thing really goes back to it being, originating in a pitch.
Obviously, there's a tremendous amount of it started there. I mean, that's where the campaign was born, and how these characters kind of came to life. But interestingly, and it's another story altogether. We've changed our target market 3 times in the past 4 years. We've gone for getting young drinkers into the brand and reconnecting them with lager. Then we went for older drinkers, to kind of harvest them and keep them staying in the brand for as long as possible. And now we've switched back to young drinkers again. And in doing so, we've had to kind of farm for a whole host of new insights and try and find a way to apply this brand in a new way to different challenges. So, yeah, the pitch was a really big deal. It set the whole campaign in motion. But I think there's been some really interesting work along the way to keep this brand relevant and keep it on target with what we needed to do. Additionally, we've had, the launch of a new product in Radler come out during this time, so we had to go and find a new way for that to come to life. We had another product in gold that was also a totally innovative kind of work stream in the project. So, yeah, the pitch was a big deal, but this has been a living, breathing, really interesting ride, and the story is poised to get a bit more interesting this year as well, which I'd love to tell you all about. If it goes brilliantly, it was all me. If it didn't, it wasn't.
Well, I think that's probably a good cliffhanger on which to close this evening's proceedings. So, firstly, I'd like to say thank you to Toby for sharing with us the deep insights into the story behind the case. Obviously, the whole case is there to be read and will be available, as will the films be released over the next few months and weeks. And to say thank you to all of you for taking time out this evening to come and listen. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you took at least one nugget away that you might think about tomorrow and as your life unfolds. So thank you very much. Thanks to Toby.